What is the meaning of life? It's a question that many of us have asked, but very few, if any, have answered. But what if our entire approach to this question is holding us all back? What if it's not a real question at all? My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. The strange intractability of the meaning of life. For a question that has almost become synonymous with philosophy itself, at least within certain corners of public perception, it's remarkable just how unproductive a lot of conversations about the so-called meaning of life are. I was reminded of this more recently while listening to friend of the channel and, just regular friend, Alex O'Connor, debate Dr. K and Greg Kuklon on the subject of whether life has meaning. And while I thought it was a good conversation, it has the same general theme that I find most discussions about life's meaning have, which is that there's not really a general agreement on what a meaning of life is and what makes such a meaning and what possible candidates for such a meaning might be. Here are just a few things that I have seen people mean when they say meaning of life. At a minimal level, when someone says they have a meaning of life, it can just be something that they happen to value. When someone says, find your meaning or find your purpose, I think they're often using the term in roughly this way. I was speaking to a friend of mine who recently has had a newborn child, and she said that the meaning of her life was now her child. I certainly don't think she was trying to claim some kind of cosmic superiority for her own child over all the other children in the world, and indeed all the other beings in the world. I just think she was expressing the fact that her life, at least in her eyes, now revolved around her child, and that she also fully endorsed this new value orientation. However, when we talk about the meaning of life, we often branch out far beyond this. I just put out a video on Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and when he outlines the meaning of a Stoic life, living in accordance with nature, he is proclaiming something far grander than what my friend was by simply referencing the meaningfulness of her child. He is not merely saying that there is some personal value in his living in accordance with nature. He is saying that this is what we've been put on this earth to do. He even uses that expression. This is because, for Stoics, there is a logos, a reason to the very structure of the universe, and as we humans are part of the universe, what our purpose is to align ourselves with that overarching cosmic purpose. And this is not too dissimilar from how people talk about the meaning of life, specifically in the context of religious debates. When someone says that God grants their life meaning, I think they're referencing some external standard which really ought to apply to us all, that is, God, and saying that their belief and alignment with Him is what makes their life meaningful and purposeful. They're making a feelings claim as well, in that they're probably saying that their own belief in God makes their life feel meaningful, but they're also saying that in a far more substantive sense, God has given the world meaning. He's given the world meaning facts. So in all of this discussion, there are a couple of questions that are being grouped together which are just not the same. First, there is the question of meaningfulness as an emotion versus meaningfulness as a philosophical position. Someone saying that their life feels meaningful is not necessarily positing meaning facts out in the world, and someone that posits a meaning for the universe as a whole may themselves actually feel pretty empty, just as the author of Ecclesiastes does. On the other hand, if you want to get something meaningful out of your newsfeed, then I recommend you check out today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Every story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal, so I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on their reporting on the recent deal reached between Cornell University and the Trump administration. Whereas left-wing sources framed this in negative terms, saying that the administration had withheld funds, right-wing sources emphasized the perceived responsibility of the university and generally framed things in a more positive manner. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by the left or the right. This feed helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs. I just don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every article I read for bias. So, receiving my ground news roundup at the end of every day means I can get a variety of news opinions, learn which sources are trustworthy, and just generally make the world less of a bewildering mess. Ground News is giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. They've genuinely become my go-to news source, and I sincerely hope that you'll check them out. But anyway, back to the video. However, a similar distinction is the question of scope. The difference between my friend's meaning found in her baby and the Stoic or the Christian is that my friend thinks that the scope of her meaning need only govern her, whereas both the Stoic and the Christian hold that their meanings should ideally govern us all. This is related, but it's not exactly the same. This means that very different claims are often being made when we talk about meaning, depending on the context or the conversation or the speaker. And this already disrupts our ability to talk about the meaning of life in a productive fashion quite a lot of the time. In his book, God and the Meanings of Life, Tim Mawson posits that questions like, what is the meaning of life, are polyvalent, meaning that they have multiple meanings that are all perfectly acceptable interpretations by competent speakers. Life can mean all life, or just human life, or just an individual life. It can even mean something broader, like the meaning of existence itself in some contexts. Mawson links meaning pretty close with causal significance towards some positively valued end, but he points out that this too has multiple meanings within it. It could be about your actions, like knowing that your life and your will amount to something, or it can be that the actions that led to your existence are significant in some important way, such as believing that you were crafted by an all-loving God. Incidentally, I got this book recommendation from Amos Vollen's Substack, and I highly recommend it. It's very good. And there are even more senses of the word meaning that we can look at. Whereas many of us talk about a meaningful life in terms of a feeling of fulfillment, this is not even the only feeling that we denote when we use the term meaningful. Take the following line from Friedrich Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols. Formula for my happiness: a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal. Or when Marcus Aurelius says that the soul harms itself whenever it fails to direct any of its own actions or impulses to a goal, but acts at random, without conscious attention. In both of these cases, rather than simply talking about personal fulfillment, they are evoking an emotional sense of directedness or organization with regards to our lives and actions. On the other hand, sometimes we talk about a meaning for life that's almost defined by our ability to withstand suffering in its name. This is the type of felt meaningfulness that can cause devoutly religious people to not recant their faith, even on pain of death. Their belief is not exactly promoting their direct human flourishing there, but we call it meaningful because it counterweighs something very disvaluable, and so must be something of extreme value to that particular person. This is the sense of meaning that almost dominates Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Reflecting on his book, Frankl says the following: I had wanted simply to convey to the reader, by way of a concrete example, that life holds a potential meaning under any conditions, even the most miserable ones. This seems like a pretty different sense of the word meaning than either the coordination of action or to denote some emotion of human fulfillment. Though, of course, that doesn't mean that they are totally unrelated. As Mawson points out, just because there is multiplicity doesn't mean that that multiplicity can't be amalgamated back into what he actually calls an amalgam. But a lot of the time, this multiplicity of meanings is just brushed over during our conversations about the meaning of life. And I'm not just talking about popular discourse either. For example, take this passage from Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. My reasoning wants to be faithful to the evidence that aroused it. That evidence is the absurd. It is that divorce between the mind that desires and the world that disappoints. My nostalgia for unity, this fragmented universe, and the contradiction that binds them together. In other words, Camus says that we go searching for meaning out in the universe, and none can be found. Thus, the condition of the absurd arises, where we feel the contradiction between our internal longing for meaning and the universe's refusal to grant us any. However, Camus does also acknowledge that this is separate from the question of having a felt meaning for life, saying, "Let us not exaggerate in this direction. In a man's attachment to life, there is something stronger than all the ills in the world. The body's judgment is as good as the mind's, and the body shrinks from annihilation. We get into the habit of living before acquiring the habit of thinking." That being said, Camus considers this bodily kind of meaning as a form of evasion and a form of irrationality. He contrasts it with the man who does not cheat what he believes to be true, and so must let that determine his action. So we still see that for Camus, the real question of life's meaning is a grand philosophical one, with the mere psychological one sort of shunted off to the side, at least at this point in the essay. His conclusion, of course, is that life genuinely is meaningless and that we have to essentially learn to deal with that in a sort of existential revolt. But my point is that he did this within the restricted domain of one possible interpretation of the question, what is the meaning of life? Which is not necessarily the only one, nor the one we are always after when we ask the question. Imagine that Camus was having a conversation with my friend who said that her newborn child lent her life a huge sense of meaning. Camus might list off all kinds of reasons why the world itself is devoid of meaning, but there's a real sense in which my friend and Camus would be talking past one another. They wouldn't even be disagreeing. They're using the same word in different ways. Ironically, Camus could actually have a coherent conversation with a Christian about the meaning of life, because at least they would both be using the term meaning in its broad cosmic sense rather than its individual sense. They would actually be disagreeing, not just seeming to disagree on the surface and masking a terminological vagueness. This also leads to a kind of conversational stalemate in our ordinary discussions about the meaning of life. Take one discussion that I had at university with two friends. The first one had become newly disillusioned with his faith, while the other had been raised in a secular household. I'll call them Mark and John for the sake of having names, but those aren't their real names. Mark was complaining that without his faith, he struggled to see a meaning to life, and John responded by saying that we can create our own meaning and so make life feel full without God. But unsurprisingly, this was of no comfort to Mark, because they were talking about different things. Mark was talking about a cosmic justification for existence in a strong normative sense that binds us all, whereas John was simply talking about a personal feeling of meaning in a much weaker sense that he then had no trouble demonstrating the possibility of. But again, they weren't disagreeing. They were just talking past one another. They were like philosophical ships in the night. So this is one reason why questions about the meaning of life can quickly become unproductive. Like Mawson, I think there is a real vagueness in the ways that we use the key terms of this debate. However, my contention actually goes one step further than this. I think we're being fooled by the structure of our language itself when it comes to this existential question. 2. Deceived by grammar. Ludwig Wittgenstein and Friedrich Nietzsche are not names that are always mentioned together. One is a titan of 20th century philosophy, and the other is a titan of 19th century philosophy. One is largely associated with the analytic tradition, and the other broadly with the continental. But they share an important observation about the way we can be deceived by language when we are doing philosophy and asking philosophical questions. Let's start with Nietzsche, and let's take a look at a passage from Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols where he touches upon this point. Nothing up to now has been more naively persuasive than the error of being, as it was formulated by the Eleatics, for instance. After all, it has on its side every word, every sentence we speak. The Eleatics were a group of pre-Socratic philosophers, including Parmenides, who believed that change was an illusion and that the true nature of the world was static, unchanging being. And Nietzsche thought that this was an assumption about the nature of true reality that then filtered down into our own philosophical approaches. And part of Nietzsche's claim here is that the Eleatics thought this because of the structure of language, which they then mistook for reality. We actually do see this exemplified in the work of Parmenides, or at least what we have of the work of Parmenides. One of the stated reasons that Parmenides gives against the reality of change is that surely being, or as he puts it, what is, cannot come from non-being, or as he puts it, what is not. And since change would involve something going from non-being to being, it must be illusory. For Parmenides, this simply followed from the grammar of his language, which he took to be almost the structure of logic itself. As he puts it, how can that which is now be hereafter? Or how can it have been? For if it hath been before, or shall be hereafter, then it is not. That is, since for something to be in the future, it must not be here now, and since that would entail something going from what is not to what is, there cannot be a differentiation between the past, the present, and the future. He thought this would entail something both being and not being, and thus would imply a contradiction. And, as he then goes on to say, all must exist in an undifferentiated, unchanging whole. So, today, we can obviously recognize his reasoning as a little bit spurious. For one thing, we now tend to talk about existence as being time relative or time indexed. We think of things existing in 2025 or in the 5th century BC. We don't even necessarily need to directly challenge Parmenides' arguments directly. It's more like we view his whole framework as mistaken from the start. Thus, the idea that what is coming from what is not entails some kind of grand philosophical contradiction is uprooted. This isn't exactly Nietzsche's point. His point's much more complicated, but Parmenides is just a good example here because we can immediately see both what has gone wrong and how he's taken a particular linguistic framework as necessarily reflective of some deeper reality. When Parmenides asks what exists or what is, he is asking an entirely different question than we would when we would approach the same question put in the same way to us. Moreover, if we were still stuck in Parmenides' particular linguistic framework, we would also find it incredibly difficult to answer these questions about change in a productive way. We would then be forced into a particular unproductive way of approaching the question, and we would thus probably struggle to get anywhere with the debate. To butcher a metaphor from Wittgenstein, it's a bit like if someone asked you to assemble a piece of IKEA furniture using only cooking implements. And speaking of, Wittgenstein made a relatively similar point in his philosophical investigations regarding a certain picture of language and of words as necessarily representational, which is a picture of language that dates at least as far back as Plato and possibly before. To simplify things pretty dramatically, Wittgenstein suggests that when we, by default, treat words as if they just stand for things, we can go badly wrong in the way we approach questions containing those words. He says the following: in the use of words, one might distinguish surface grammar from depth grammar. What immediately impresses itself upon us about the use of a word is the way it is used in the construction of the sentence, the part of its use, one might say, that can be taken in by the ear. The idea here bears a passing resemblance to Nietzsche's in its broad strokes, though with a much more outwardly analytic framing and a lot of difference in the details. But for our purposes, we can simply note that Wittgenstein too holds that the way that we posit philosophical questions grammatically can lead us down the garden path regarding how to answer it. Again, we can think of Parmenides and his theories about what is and what is not, deriving a contradiction from what is just a feature of his surface grammar. We could also think of Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God, provided that you disagree with it. This argument asks us to imagine the greatest possible being, and then states that, among the properties of the greatest possible being, there must be existence, since to exist in the world is greater than to exist merely in imagination. This argument rests on an assumption that existence is a form of property or predicate in just the same way that redness is or greatness is. The initial persuasiveness of the ontological argument is partly because we say things like "my dog is real" or "my dog exists in reality," if you prefer, in the same kind of way that we say things like "my dog is red." In each case, there is an object, the dog, and a predicate that is ascribed to them, either existence or redness. This surface-level similarity masks the underlying fact that existence and redness are actually incredibly different, and we may want to argue against the idea that existence is a predicate in the same way that redness is a predicate. Hence, the whole family of responses to the ontological argument which do argue that existence is not a predicate. These arguments are, in fact, pointing out that the surface grammar of the ontological argument is misleading. One specific tendency that Wittgenstein mentions, among many, many others, is our propensity to get deceived by names. The surface grammar of naming something encourages us to analyze and explore that concept by treating it as a singular external thing that we can refer to and must investigate as a singular thing. As Marie McGinn puts it in her chapter on Wittgenstein's grammar, Wittgenstein's concern is not with the construction of well-formed sentences, but with the way words are employed in our life with language, with the ways in which we operate with words. Depth grammar is, on this reading, concerned with aspects of use that both traditional grammar and philosophical grammar ignore. The circumstances in which we use expressions, the circumstances in which we are trained to use them, the ways in which their use is integrated with other activities, and so on. On this interpretation, at least, Wittgenstein is not necessarily saying that analysing a concept in the traditional way is never useful, but he is encouraging us to explore other areas and other approaches, and not become fixed into a certain habit of philosophical approach that may be unhelpful. McGinn talks about Wittgenstein's application of this methodology to the philosophical problem of what a thought is or what thinking refers to. The way the word to think is used, its place in the network of concepts which constitutes our conceptual scheme, shows that I think that P is not a report of an internal state which only the person speaking has access to, or about which he may be said to be infallible. For it assumes that having a thought is a matter of how things stand in an inner realm, whereas a grammatical investigation of the role of the word to think in our conceptual network shows that this is not how the expression is used. In other words, the implicit referential story that we're telling ourselves misleads us as to how to analyze philosophical problems concerning the nature of thought. To take this back to the idea of meaning and the question of the meaning of life, I would suggest that here too, we have fallen under the spell of a particular way of approaching the question. We look at the form of the question, what is the meaning of life, and immediately start searching for a thing out in the world, be it the physical or the metaphysical world, that closely aligns with our intuitive concept of meaning. In this way, it mirrors the kind of matching game that people also play with terms like good or bad, or with mathematical truths. As Hugh Price might put it, we are trying to do a very sophisticated version of the same sort of thing we did as kids when we matched the name of the farmyard animal to its picture. There are a few things that I think this uncritical acceptance of this linguistic framing does. The first is almost completely blind us to the many different uses of the term meaning that we looked at in the last section. If we frame the debate around looking for a single type of object that will define meaning, then of course we're going to have people saying you can't have meaning in life without God, and another set of people totally perplexed by such an attitude, since they're using the term in different ways, and thus they are failing to have a substantive disagreement. But our framing makes it look deceptively like they are having a substantive disagreement. It's a bit like if you and I spent 20 minutes arguing about the ethics of euthanasia, only for it to later emerge that I thought we were talking about adolescence in and around the Far East. But the second, maybe more fundamental issue is that we are treating the question, what is the meaning of life, as if it is only and could only be about a thing called meaning applied to a thing called life. If this is the framing to our question, then, as I'll go on to argue, we will miss out on a whole load of other ways to approach the question of life's meaning, since we are trapped in a particular, quite narrow mode of thought. Whether we're talking about personal meaning or cosmic meaning, we're instinctively giving priority to an object that we perceive to be the cause of the felt meaningfulness, whether that is God or a child or a set of values. It's not that I think it is totally unproductive to approach the question in this way, I just think it shouldn't be the only way of approaching the question. And next, I want to bring these two observations about the issues with which we approach the question of life's meaning together, and just explore what happens if we begin to let go of them. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel, or if you're feeling incredibly generous and want to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow-motion book-by-book bookshelf tour, then consider subscribing to the Patreon, though it's absolutely no pressure. The links are in the description. 3. Meanings, functions, and alternatives. Okay, we've gone through a lot, so let's just recap. We've so far raised two problems with the way we approach what is the meaning of life. The first was to do with the polyvalence of the terms meaning and life. The second was a broader concern about the linguistic framing of the question that locked us into a particular mode of answering it, one where we look for candidates for the term meaning to refer to. Here, we'll see what might happen if we let go of these inhibitions. This section is largely just going to be my own preliminary thoughts on the subject, so please do add a grain of salt to whatever I'm saying, in addition to the salt that already comes pre-packaged with watching some random guy ramble on the internet. So, what are the alternatives to the matching game that we discussed in the last section? Well, one of Hugh Price's suggestions is a different form of linguistic analysis, which he has developed from earlier thinkers. For him, we ought to begin our analysis of language with a sense of a given term's function and use. It's a relatively intuitive idea, and it's not technically even in conflict with the more traditional types of philosophical analysis that we've just looked at, but it does provide us with a different avenue for inquiry. And the difference is probably best illustrated by reference to how Price employs it with another philosophically resistant word, truth. In his paper, Truth as Convenient Friction, Price discusses not what truth is, but what truth does. That is, how do we use the term true in our language? To simplify things, he eventually concludes that truth functions as a norm of discourse that signals we cannot accept a disagreement in a given area. When I say, that's not true, I am condemning an utterance, and I'm signaling that I will not accept it in my model of the world, and also that no one else should either. That doesn't mean that Price rejects the notion of truth entirely. He's just approaching the question, what is truth, from a different methodology, a functional or pragmatic one, rather than an object-based one. The reason that we would need such a word is relatively evident. Believing the things that we call untrue tends to lead to disadvantageous behavior, and so we collectively have a vested interest in rewarding statements that we see and can establish as true, and punishing those that we see as false. For more on this later point, you can check out Price's book, Facts and the Function of Truth, as well as the aforementioned paper, both of which he has very kindly provided for free on his website. So, how do we apply this kind of methodology to the question of life's meaning? Well, the first step is to ask, what are we doing when we call something meaningful? How does this differ from the function of calling something meaningless, all the while bearing in mind the point made by Mawson that these are likely polyvalent terms containing a multitude of functions within them? This section is just a beginning sketch, and please do feel free to posit your own proposed functions. So, as just one sketch function, it seems to me that calling something meaningful marks it out as worth expending effort over, or otherwise just worth accepting a cost over. If I call my work meaningful, at least to me, I'm designating it as something I am willing to suffer a cost in terms of time and effort to achieve. Moreover, it seems that to call something meaningful is to say that we view it as worth sacrificing for in itself, rather than simply as a means to an end. Say I was an investment banker and I found my work meaningless but was motivated entirely by money, in which case the work is just a means to an end, and I think the banker would call the money meaningful, not the work itself. As we touched upon earlier, it seems like there are two directions we can take this function. We can either use it at the individual level and say that it is something worth incurring a cost for me, or at the wider level and argue that it is something worth incurring a cost for everyone. I take it that a Christian thinks it is worth it for anyone to make a sacrifice in furtherance of their relationship with God, not just them. Now, this function is then secretly two functions. One is psychological and the other is ethical. And just within this identified function, which will be one of many, there are already further sensible questions that we can ask. There is the question of what, for an individual, genuinely does lead to the ability to incur costs for the sake of future felt meaningful benefit. And there is the question of what, in the strong sense of the word, people accept as a good justification for sacrifices. The difference between the two actually ties quite nicely back into Price's analysis of the truth norm. The personal version permits of disagreements where no one is in the wrong, whereas the wider version chooses something to endorse that doesn't just bind those who opt in, but is supposed to bind anyone and everyone. This extends the function of the second beyond that of the first, whereas the personal use of meaningful simply signals a way to predict our own behavior in the same way saying I like Marmite would predict that I would eat Marmite. The second has a persuasive and rhetorical function. It wishes to encourage others to adopt the proposed meaning as their own. And let's just take the psychological variant of meaning for a second, because even just within this single function, I think that it can demonstrate the benefit of separating ourselves just a little from that object-focused inquiry that we were trapped in earlier in the video. Because if we're asking what might lead someone to incur costs in service of some future goal, we don't necessarily need to make the goal itself the primary causal factor. I'm sorry to reference Nietzsche yet again, but I think this is one of his cleverest observations in Twilight of the Idols. He pointed out the way that we often confuse cause and effect in our analysis of philosophical and psychological questions. As he puts it, the most general formula at the basis of every religion and morality is do this and this, refrain from this, and you will be happy. Otherwise, the so-called motive, another error, merely a surface phenomenon of consciousness, an accompaniment to an act which conceals, rather than exposes, the antecedentia of the act. Among a lot of other things, this passage refers to our tendency to think that it is our beliefs and our stated values, our seemingly explicit sources of meaning, that are the causal factor that gives our lives that feeling of meaning and allows us to have well-organized and well-constituted wills, when, at least in this passage, Nietzsche's arguing that it's the other way round. Both the feeling of meaningfulness and the stated values themselves are outgrowths of the physiological and psychological organization of the person holding them. Thus, for Nietzsche in this passage, if we're trying to predict uses of the word meaning and meaningful, we should look to the instincts rather than any objects out in the world. Now, you may not want to be as extreme as Nietzsche is here, but my point is that he provides a radically different way of approaching the question, one which de-emphasizes the meaningful object and re-emphasizes the person finding meaning. And we wouldn't be able to access this alternative perspective if we didn't let go, at least a little bit, of that object-style way of phrasing questions about life's meaning. But even if we do think that an explicit stated meaning for your life is causally efficacious, we can start thinking about possible constraints on how a meaning for life might actually be able to fulfill its allotted function. In this case, that function is marking something out as worth sacrificing for. An example might help illustrate what I mean. For instance, Tolstoy argues that a meaning for life must achieve at least these three things. He actually describes these as the essence of religion, but he's using the term religion a little wider than we would. 1, make us believe there is creative order in the universe. 2, justify our care for one another. And 3, preserve a sense that our lives matter after we are gone. Tolstoy answers these challenges with Orthodox Christianity, but taken apart from that, we can see them as plausible constraints on the kinds of beliefs that would encourage a sense of meaning psychologically. You might disagree with those constraints, but they can now be viewed as a hypothesis. Moreover, if we recognize that there might be more than one function for our concept of meaning, then we can open even more fruitful avenues for questioning. For example, one function for meaning that Mawson talks about is the ability to coordinate action. So here, something being meaningful for someone is the extent to which their entire desire apparatus is coordinated around that thing. A good example might be Proust, who seemingly structured his entire life around his writings, or Napoleon, who, for good or for ill, had a fairly one-track mind about things. This is clearly related to the point about sacrifice, but it's a subtly different function. Someone might have 3 or 4 competing things that they would sacrifice or incur significant costs for, and so have more meaning in this former sense of having things to sacrifice for. However, their life would be less meaningful in the second sense, since they can't be as focused on one thing if they find many different things meaningful. This is why I think bearing in mind that polyvalence point is so important. We are then genuinely communicating different things when we say meaningful, and apart from very minimal constraints like communicating a positive vibe towards that thing, the function of the label does not need to be the same in every case. And once we recognize this, we can also appreciate Mawson's point that there are genuine tensions in our different senses of the words meaning and meaningful, which means that coming up with a final solution to meaning problems or a meaning crisis might just be a bit of a dead end. To slightly modify another of Mawson's examples, two conflicting senses of the word meaningful are, one, fitting into some kind of grander or higher purpose, and two, self-determination, that is, shaping your own path as an individual. These are in tension. To fit into a higher plan of a higher being is to give up at least some of your own autonomy, while total self-determination means that you're following your own nose and not any grander nose. Mawson uses this to account for why some people see God as adding meaning to their life, while others, most notably and famously Jean-Paul Sartre, see God's absence as adding meaning to our lives, and would be dismayed to find out that God existed. Under this framing, when a disagreement arises as to whether God would add or detract from meaning in our lives, the answer is yes. He would add to our meaning in one sense and would detract from it in another. Whether you personally find that God would add or detract meaning from your life tells you something about the relative affectual sway that the different senses of the word meaning have in your particular psychological makeup. We can really see how letting go of a few assumptions in the way we approach the question has opened up entire new ways to approach it. By releasing ourselves from the idea that meaning has one, meaning, we can begin to resolve, or rather dissolve, some of the classic disputes about meaning. It becomes immediately much clearer why some people see God's absence as bringing meaninglessness, while others see it as freeing up new meaning. It even opens up the possibility that different senses of the word meaning are irreconcilably in tension or contradiction, and that maximizing felt meaningfulness in life might be a matter of continually balancing different factors rather than finding some final answer. If we agree with Mawson here, then we should be pretty skeptical about people offering panaceas for meaning, since there is no end state of maximal meaningfulness that will work for every and all senses of the word meaning. On the other hand, by allowing ourselves to explore outside of the object-style framing of the question, we can begin to ask whether we have our causal chains the right way round. Could it be that both a sense of meaningfulness and a particular set of beliefs about meaning are stemming from something further upstream, like a particular psychological constitution or economy of drives? Or, to take a more down-to-earth version of this, could it be that there are certain mere physical constraints on our felt sense of meaning? For someone who is starving, surely we will bring them far closer to having a meaning of life by finding them some food, rather than providing a lengthy philosophical answer. It seems pretty likely that the answer to at least some kinds of nihilism and meaninglessness is less philosophical and more straightforwardly practical. But we'll struggle to recognize this if we are fixed into thinking that the meaning of life is a question of defining and identifying an object called meaning. For instance, I have argued previously on the channel that an underrepresented factor in crises of meaning in the UK is probably being unable to achieve certain narrative beats that we've been told make for a good adult life. Things like home ownership or the ability to start a family. And here, the solution could be economic rather than just philosophical. And look, I'm not saying that any of the approaches outlined in this video are perfect. In fact, I'm pretty certain that they're not. There is so much more to be thought and said. I'm just suggesting that, considering how intractable debates and discussions around life's meaning are, the approaches that I've given here are at least worth considering, and the way we pose the question of life's meaning can sometimes close us off to them. But of course, these observations about possible polyvalence lurking in the meaning of our words and the way our language can force us into particular ways of approaching questions go far beyond just what is the meaning of life. There are a plethora of assumptions that we routinely fall into when we are conducting our inquiries, whether in philosophy or elsewhere. They may sometimes be justified, but Underlying assumptions are almost always worth questioning rather than just accepting uncritically. Sometimes something that we are studying as one concept is best apprehended as several. Sometimes we are treating something as an object when it's best seen as a kind of function, or vice versa. Sometimes we're treating a property as on or off when it's gradable, like the old question of how many hairs turn stubble into a beard. Sometimes we are pretending something has a clear and precise definition when it is, in fact, a cluster concept or a family resemblance term. It's not that I think such assumptions are never justified. We do have to assume some things when we're answering questions, or else we will definitely never get anywhere. My point here is much more modest. I just want to note that we shouldn't treat these assumptions as unchallengeable when we are conducting our philosophy, and we should try not to forget that we do have them. As we found in the case of meaning, sometimes it is in questioning the unspoken assumptions of a conversation that we find we can turn one big, seemingly intractable problem into many smaller, more tractable ones. So, while I do hope this video has encouraged you to rethink how we put questions like, what is the meaning of life? I also hope it has emphasized just how deceptive our language can be, and how sometimes progress in a question, be it philosophical or otherwise, is found in asking a meta-question. That is, are we posing the right question? But if you want to learn more about different ways to approach philosophy, I have a video right here that presents a slightly different approach to looking at logical fallacies. I hope you enjoyed the video and have a wonderful day.